When most people imagine horror in tabletop role-playing games, they imagine monsters. A creature in the dark. Something stalking the players. Something that can eventually be confronted. That form of horror is familiar and often effective, but it also has a structural limitation. You see, monsters create confrontation, and confrontation usually implies resolution. Once the creature is identified, the table begins asking a different kind of question. Not what is happening, but how do we overcome it? You see, there's another form of horror that behaves very differently, and it rarely relies on monsters at all. Monster horror is external. There's a threat. It can usually be located, studied, and eventually confronted. Even if the creature is truly terrifying, it exists as a discrete problem. The players may not defeat it immediately, but the structure of the encounter suggests that resolution is possible. Over time, this creates a recognizable pattern. Mystery leads to investigation. Investigation leads to confrontation. And confrontation leads to a resolution. This structure works well for adventure and action, but sustained dread rarely survives once confrontation becomes inevitable. In one campaign I ran, the players encountered a genuinely unsettling, unknown entity during their first few sessions. At first, the group approached the situation with both caution and dread. They debated what it might be and whether they should engage with it at all. But once they discovered the creature had clear weaknesses, the atmosphere changed. Mystery gave way to strategy. Monster horror is external. There's a threat. It can be located, studied, and eventually confronted. Even if the creature is terrifying, the structure implies resolution. Eventually, the players will try to defeat it. Institutional horror works differently. Institutional horror is systemic. The threat is not a creature. The threat is the structure surrounding the players. Institutional horror emerges when the system itself becomes unstable. A town that refuses to acknowledge what is happening. A university that suppresses certain information. A church that quietly alters its records. A government agency that changes official reports. In these situations, the threat is not a single enemy. The threat is a pattern, and patterns are much harder to confront. Players cannot simply defeat a structure. They must understand it first. And understanding a system often reveals deeper uncertainty rather than resolution. I once ran a scenario where the players began investigating a series of strange disappearances. At first, they assumed the cause would be a creature or a cult operating in secret. But the deeper they investigated, the more they realized the town itself was quietly causing and maintaining the situation. If you want horror to last longer than a single encounter, shift the threat from creatures to systems. Instead of asking what the monster is, ask what structure allows the problem to persist. Is the town protecting itself? Are the institutions hiding information? Are records being altered or ignored? When the threat becomes systemic, players stop asking how to defeat it. They start asking, how deep does this pattern go? You see, monster horror creates spikes of fear. There's a sudden encounter, a shocking revelation, a dangerous confrontation. These moments can be powerful, but they usually fade once the encounter ends. Institutional horror creates something different. It creates pressure. When players realize the system around them may be compromised, every interaction becomes uncertain. Every conversation may hide information. Every document may contain omissions. That pressure lingers between encounters. And that lingering pressure sustains dread across sessions. In that previous campaign, the players eventually realized the town council had been quietly altering historical records for decades. You see, it wasn't some ghoul from beyond. It wasn't a creature they could defeat. It was an entire town leadership whose structure was hiding their plans in plain sight behind seemingly boring charts and graphs. But that realization changed how the group interacted with every document from then on. Monster horror creates spikes. A creature appears, the players react, the situation resolves. Institutional horror creates pressure. When the system itself becomes unreliable, every interaction carries uncertainty. Spikes fade, but pressure accumulates. And accumulated pressure sustains dread much longer than a single confrontation. When the threat is a monster, players behave like hunters. They gather information about weaknesses. They prepare for the confrontation. When the threat is systemic, players behave differently. They analyze patterns. They question authority. They search for inconsistencies. The focus of the table shifts from combat to interpretation. And that shift creates a very different kind of tension. Monsters are a familiar form of horror, but they are not the only one. And they are rarely the most enduring. Institutional horror replaces confrontation with corrosion. It replaces enemies with systems, and systems are much, much harder to escape.